Good evening to you all, and welcome to this event organized by the Institute for Greater Europe. We're a pan-European think tank focusing on contemporary issues affecting the European Union and its neighboring regions. My name is Adrian Waters. I'm the Institute's Democratization Desk Officer. And in today's event, we're going to discuss the impact of the EU's state building and enlargement policies on democracy in the Western Balkan region. This region includes candidate countries such as Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Macedonia, but also Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo, which are candidates for the candidate status. Now, before I start, I'd like to thank all the speakers today who have accepted my invitation, but also I'd like to express my gratitude to Kira Pakarinen and Krista Tamila, who are the Institute's event officers, and Leonardo Rodriguez, our social media officer. So now I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the topic of the event before giving the floor to Professor Bieber, who's going to be our first speaker. From the early 2000s onwards, the European Union has been the key state building actor in the Western Balkans. Its efforts were undertaken by conditionality and enlargement policy mechanisms. The EU's state-building aim was not only to build stable, well-functioning states, but also to ensure that these countries can be accepted as fully fledged member states of the Union. As a matter of fact, the Western Balkans is an area where the EU has more influence than any other state-building actor, simply because of the enlargement prospect, which has enabled it to request the most profound changes in the political, economic, judicial, and military spheres of the countries in the region. Over the years, an abundant amount of scholarly material on the topic has emerged, providing a mixed assessment of the EU state-building policies in the Balkans. From a positive perspective, conditionality has been praised as an effective tool through which the EU has affected both the speed and the results of the transitional reforms in post-communist states prior to their accession. This also contributed to the democratization of the Balkan countries in the early 2000s. On the negative side, some have highlighted the asymmetry between the Union's conditionality and its rewards, while others have argued that it has allowed extensive EU interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states. More recently, it has been claimed that EU state-building policies and enlargement fatigue have turned the Balkan candidate countries into stabilitocracies. For the sake of the audience, stabilitocracies is a term coined by the Montenegrin scholar Srđan Pavlović, who at the moment is at the University of Alberta, Canada, and would have gladly taken part in this event if it hadn't been for prior engagements. He used this term to describe countries in the region whose authoritarian practices are disregarded by the European Union as long as they provide some form of stability or satisfy geostrategic interests. Since 2015, many academics have explained how the Western Balkans have turned into a geopolitical battleground between the European Union and other powers fighting for influence, notably Russia, China, and Turkey. This in turn forced the European Union to adopt realpolitik in its relations with candidate countries, and thus fostering the phenomenon of stabilitocracy to the point that now all the states in the region are considered to be hybrid regimes by Freedom House. Now, in order to get a better picture of the present situation with regards to EU state building and enlargement policies and their impact on democracy in the Western Balkan region, I invited 4 experts who are all prominent speakers and experts on the topic, and we all feel very lucky to have them. First up, we have Professor Florian Bieber. He's a professor of Southeast European history and politics, as well as the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. He's also the coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group and the editor and author of numerous books, such as The Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans and Debating Nationalism. Professor Bieber, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adrian, for the invitation and the chance to discuss this topic. And I mean, I guess in our introductory round, I'm just going to make a few points which I think define this topic. I mean, you mentioned there are two topics. One is state building, the other one is democracy. They're not inherently the same. But I think there are a couple of points which are structural in explaining this relationship of the EU to the Western Balkans, and others are maybe more based on a particular set of circumstances which have crystallized themselves in recent years. So I would start by saying that the EU has always been, the EU is not the EU, it's multiple actors. And also there've been two assumptions. One is what the EU does, and one is what the EU is or offers. So there's the EU state building and democratization, as you will, by intervening through its policies, through its actors, through its special envoys, through the efforts of the High Representative for Foreign Security Policy, for example, in the region. And the other one is the assumed but elusive attractiveness of joining the European Union. Now, overall, the performance has been, I would say, disappointing because only one country joined, Croatia, and that's already 8 years ago or 9 years ago, and none of the others are close to joining. And many of the open issues in the region, which are important for state building, have not been resolved. In fact, have been worsened. Bosnia-Herzegovina is in a worse place. Kosovo-Serbia relations are nowhere close to being resolved. And in fact, countries which should be negotiating with the EU for many years, in particular North Macedonia, as well as Albania, are still blocked by an EU member state. So I think from that point of view, I think we cannot come to a conclusion that this process, which was thought to be going well, has delivered. Besides the fact that the state of democracy in the region continues to be not satisfactory in many cases, although it's not. Some countries like Serbia are in a considerably worse situation when it comes to democracy than all the other countries in the region, which have performed much better, including places like Kosovo. So I think what is the problem? I mean, one of the problems is that the EU assumed a lot will happen nearly automatically, like a deus ex machina, by the virtue of offering membership, and this is not materialized. I think we can discuss why this is, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that elites have captured the process and basically prevented and shielded democratization dynamics to occur, and they've learned lessons from earlier enlargements in many ways. So I think this is one of the reasons. The other one is that the EU has been taken a process where there's a lot of merit in open-ended discussions and debates. It's not very much solution-oriented, but it's very much debate-oriented. This is in its very nature and its DNA in many ways, in the way it itself operates. But this has not been very effective with resolving issues in the region, in particular moving Bosnia-Herzegovina towards a more functional state, or resolving Serbia-Kosovo non-recognition, which of course, which impacts democracy in Serbia and state building in Kosovo, you could argue. And the EU has not resolved it. Or it has drifted off in this very transactional approach in recent years, which was when the border changes were discussed between the two by the Mogherini High Representative, which didn't go anywhere. So these are kind of some of the structural reasons. The other one is that the EU is no longer a singular actor when it comes to enlargement. The Commissioner for Enlargement, Oliver Vahey, is a representative not just of the Commission, but of course not officially by the treaties. He is only supposed to represent the European Union, but de facto he's also representing the interests of Viktor Orban, who is not exactly in line with the European Commission's policy towards enlargement. And this has been a clash. So he has been actively promoting a different understanding of enlargement, even not explicitly, but implicitly, indirectly, one which is not a merit-based enlargement, but an enlargement which favors certain countries based on the geopolitical interest, in particular of Hungary and Viktor Orban. So the EU is not speaking in a single voice. I mean, this is also structural with the rise of the member states in the enlargement process, which means that we have the obstructionists, as Greece used to be and as Bulgaria is at the moment, and the countries which are favoring enlargement, but exactly for the reason of promoting autocratic rule, their own autocratic rule, like Hungary or to some degree Janša Slovenia had been. And all of that undermines the transformative dimension of all of that. So to wrap up, I think there are structural reasons why the EU has not delivered on what was expected maybe 10, 15 years ago. And then there are particular circumstances, namely the rise of authoritarian member states governments, the fragmentation of EU policy in its own right, and a kind of transactional approach, which also meant that sometimes issues such as stopping migration routes to the Western Balkans was more important than democracy or state building. So again, the confluence of these factors explains, I think, where we are now, which is a place where, in fact, the EU has failed on its own goals and ambitions. Of course, it's not the only cause for the failure, but there are many reasons why I think it's appropriate to identify the European Union as having failed in its goals for state building and democracy in the Western Balkans.
Thank you very much, Professor Bieber, for your enlightening perspective. And now I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Professor Marie-Janine Čalić. She's a professor of East and Southeast European history at the University of Munich in Germany. She worked and consulted for the special coordinator of the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe in Brussels, for the United Nations Protection Force headquarters in Zagreb, Croatia, and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. She's a regular commentator on Balkan affairs for the media, and among publications, there is A History of Yugoslavia and Tito, a biography. Professor Čalić, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and kind introduction. I believe that most experts would agree that the response from the European Union towards the Western Balkans has been inconsistent in many ways, as Florian has summarized just a minute ago. Enlargement has developed into an excessively bureaucratic and technical process. The most recent European Court of Editors report on the EU support for the rule of law in the Western Balkans, which was published in January this year, concludes that there was little impact in advancing fundamental reforms. Klingendahl spoke even about entrenchment of the mentioned stabilitocracy, which was explained in the introduction. On the other hand, annual reports by the European Commission is quite depressing reading. All over the region, there's growing nationalism, which blocks reforms. The region is backsliding in many respects. As has been mentioned, Freedom House has assessed Western Balkan countries as only partly free. Serbia and Montenegro have been downgraded from semi-consolidated democracy to hybrid regimes. Serbia has even been placed among the 10 most autocratized regimes in the world. So when it comes to development of democratization, this development really raised concern. Not to forget the economic situation. The pandemic has plunged the Western Balkan economies into recession. Now, with the war in Ukraine, there are strong fears of rising energy and food prices, and also concerns that this might affect the European economy as such. And as we know, the Western Balkans' most important trading partners is the European Union. And if they fall into recession, then this would heavily affect Western Balkan countries as well. 1/5 of the population of the Western Balkan states already lives in the EU. There's heavy brain drain. Many people have already left the region. Many others intend to leave. Every second Bosnian and 2/3 of the Albanians say they would like to emigrate. And in addition to all of that, the war in Ukraine brings back painful memories and fears related to the 1990s wars. Some regions have seen resurgence of tensions, Bosnia and Herzegovina in the first place, but also among Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. Now, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have filed applications for EU membership, and this somehow changes the setup of enlargement policy. Although we all know that the European Commission will probably take a while in assessing these applications and that membership is not imminent. Yet the question arises what this actually means for the Western Balkan countries, and I can see two basic strands of arguments, two different opinions. One set of analysts believe that the Ukrainian cause might accelerate the whole process for the Balkans too, because it brings new momentum and also a sense of urgency to the whole process of enlargement. Others, however, maintain that we risk that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict will take the Western Balkan countries in a way hostage. If this conflict prevails, then the enlargement in the Western Balkans might be delayed forever or pushed to a very distant future. In the region, only, as if I'm not mistaken, only Foreign Minister of Northern Macedonia has publicly supported the Ukrainian wish for EU membership. Other countries have been tellingly silent. Now, while it is true that Russia's attack on the Ukraine has somehow stimulated consensus within the EU on certain issues, namely sanctions towards Russia, as Florian has stressed, there is still little consensus on other important issues like enlargements. There is no indication of any agreement being reached in time to allow the next European Council in June 2022 to set a date for opening of accession negotiations with Albania and Northern Macedonia. All of this mainly reflects a problem on the EU side: unilateralism, populism, lack of absorption capacity. Not to forget that opinion polls show how low support for Western Balkans accession actually is in EU member states. In view of that, some alternative models are on the table. I just mentioned two that we might discuss. One proposition which has been made by several think tanks relates to the common market. It has been suggested that early integration into the common market could be done by accession to the European Economic Area. So joining the single market, as Finland, Sweden, or Austria did in '94, could be an option for Western Balkan countries by the year of 2030. Alternatively, it has been suggested that a framework for a Southeast European Economic Area should be or could be created. A second major alternative to the current enlargement process is an appeal for the idea of staged accession, or as was said, differentiated integration. According to this proposition, integration would pass certain stages from an initial accession to intermediate, some new form of membership, and then eventually conventional membership. each step bringing certain benefits, but also obligations for countries in the region. I believe that these propositions sound interesting and need to be discussed. However, some fundamental problems need to be resolved first. One is the question of political conditionality. Even if we go for the common market model, the question remains whether countries could join such an the European Economic Area if they have an open conflict with a neighbor, or if they are actually a dysfunctional state like Bosnia. And this brings me to my second concern as regards these alternatives, namely reforms and political will. Even if we go for a more modest option like economic integration or staged accession, certain reforms need to be done first. This requires a political will. This requires, in the first place, also political will to normalize relations with neighbors. And thirdly, it requires unanimity within the European Union on a new process, on an alternative model to the one which the EU has been pursuing now for decades. And to conclude, I'm afraid none of these conditions is on the horizon now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Čalić, for your contribution. And now we're going to pass on to Dr. Søren Kiel. He's the academic head of the International Research and Consulting Center at the Institute of Federalism at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. He has worked as an expert for several international organizations, governments, and civil society groups. He's a trained political scientist with more than 15 years of experience and has authored and edited 10 books, including Power Sharing in Europe and A New Eastern Question, Great Powers and the Post-Yugoslav States. Dr. Kiel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Would like to share a few slides with you for two reasons. A, because I like visual representation, and B, because I'm going to totally use the chance to promote this fantastic book. You know, it's literally just come out, makes great summer readings for your vacation. More importantly, it makes a great present. The nice thing with IGE Dem publishers is it's not that expensive to buy. So instead of buying an expensive book from Palgrave or Routledge, you can buy 2 or 3 books of this particular book. But coming back to the more serious debate, what I would like to do is pick up where the 2 previous speakers left off. But I think we've heard a bit about the dynamics of the EU and what went wrong, and also some reasons of why. And I want to look at it a little bit more about the dynamics of what's happening in the region, and particularly also focus on the external dimension to all. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that, of course, in addition to what Florian said about the EU not being a single actor, and there's seemingly being a difference between what the EU should be doing and what the EU is doing, we also need to keep in mind that the EU's position and policies on the region have substantially shifted and changed in the last 30 years, right? I mean, in the 1990s, the EU was very much still trying to find a position toward the region. We seem to forget sometimes that the whole reason why we have an EU foreign policy, and particularly also an EU defense policy, is because of developments in the region. When we actually look at when did EU policies, the enlargement framework, the proper engagement, some of which Florian mentioned, with lots of interventions by EU high representatives, when did that actually happen? It's a relatively short period, right? The full engagement of the EU with the region and the full throttle of what many people call EU member state building, this active involvement, probably finished around 2006, 2007, right? Certainly, some people would say it finishes with the failure of constitutional reform in Bosnia. Other people say it finishes in the run-up to the independence of Kosovo, because that's when the unity of the EU falls apart towards the region, right? So, but certainly it lasts for effectively probably less than 10 years, right? And since then, we have this period that has been called stabiliocracy. Some people refer to it simply as EU enlargement fatigue. I like to best look at it. I like this perspective of looking at it as a period of multiple EU crises, and the failure to engage with the region and the resulting situation in the region that both previous speakers have mentioned are exactly a result of these crises, whether that is a financial crisis, 2009, whether that is the refugee crisis, whether that is Brexit and the fallout from this, right? So we are seeing a series of internal EU crises which have a direct effect on enlargement. Now, as a result of these shifting priorities for the EU and this period of crises, we are seeing three important developments. And I think the first two have been mentioned, right? The increase of the bureaucracies, the rise of authoritarian regimes, the consolidation of the authoritarian elements that already existed. It's not like the Western Balkan states were blooming democracies in, the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then became, authoritarian. They had authoritarian elements, but in the early 2000s, most people were optimistic they might turn towards democratic consolidation, and that clearly hasn't happened. The second thing is, of course, the emergence of new regional conflicts. We've talked about Bosnia. We've talked about Serbia, Kosovo. Of course, Croatia, Bosnia is a new dynamic that's certainly been substantially increased since Croatia joined the EU, and has leverage over the political process in Bosnia as an EU member state that can block Bosnia's integration. Can talk about Greece/Bulgaria and North Macedonia as well. And the point I want to say one or two words about is, in the absence of a strong pull from the EU towards the region, other actors become more important. And these other actors have very different interests, right? We thought a new Eastern question would be a great title, right? Everybody who likes a bit of history will, hopefully appreciate the title. But we are not in the business of playing geopolitics, right? And it's also not a zero-sum game, because not all of these other actors have contradictory interests to the EU, right? So China is very interesting in that regard. It's very hard to say Chinese interests in the region are anti-European. In many respects, they are not. Right? In many respects, China sees the region as an access point towards the European Union, right? With Russia, it's a bit easier. You can really make the spoiler argument. Dimitar Bechev calls it a rival power, right? But again, Turkey is very difficult to position because it's not per se anti-European. And again, the Gulf countries have very specific interests. And one of the interesting points is often the question that people raise, well, are these actors becoming more visible because the EU and the US as well are less visible, right? So only because you do less, others, do more. A little bit like, running a marathon. If the person that sprinted ahead gets slower and slower, you're catching up with them, no matter how steady you're going. Or are these countries really more engaged in the region and doing more? And you can show that some of them are doing more. China has substantially increased its investment. Russia has increased its political presence, its backing for people like Milorad Dodik in Bosnia. That has substantially, you can see how Russia diverges from consensus with the West after 2006, 2007, towards a very confrontational approach. And the same with Turkey, you can show how under Foreign Minister Davutoglu, investment and engagement with the region really goes up, right? Now, what does that all mean for the EU? I think that's a fundamental question. And this is where Professor Karlik has mentioned that Ukraine becomes very interesting, right? Because I think Ukraine is a watershed moment, and I think I agree that it has multiple ways of where it can go from it. But the war in Ukraine offers a really good perspective on where the countries of the Western Balkans are in relation to the EU. And that there are some countries that very clearly on positioned themselves with the EU against the aggression, joined very early in the sanctions, right, condemning the aggression and increasing and supporting Ukraine, while Serbia, for example, did not join the sanctions, right? The only country nowadays in Europe, other than Belarus, that you can still fly to Russia from is Serbia, right? You still have direct flights. So you have an increase in political tensions that result from the Ukraine conflict, which shows how much Russia has become ingrained in the political systems in Bosnia, but also as a key actor, for example, in the Serbia and Kosovo relationship. And it puts the EU fully on the spotlight to say, well, if Russia can do this to Ukraine, what can it do to the region, right? And what does it mean for the security provisions? Now, from the point of security, some people are less worried because they say, with the exception of Bosnia and Serbia and Kosovo, all other countries are NATO members. So there is a common security environment. But that doesn't mean that there is no potential for conflict. And I think the EU is certainly reacting, right? It's no coincidence that the German foreign minister flew to the region very shortly after the start of the war in Ukraine, right? I don't think that's an accident. I think that was done on purpose, that the EU Commission has refocused on enlargement, not just as a result of Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia submitting applications, but also, you know, making sure, well, there are all these other countries that have been waiting, and completely having to rethink, you know, how do we engage with the region in light of shifting dynamics further east in Europe. Whether that will be enough to re-engage more long-term and to start the enlargement process again, we will have to see, as the British like to say, that proof really is in the pudding, right? We have to see if concrete actions follow the more symbolic engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kale, for your presentation. And now, last but not least, we have Professor Biljana Vankovska. She's a full professor at the Institute for Security, Defense and Peace at the University St. Cyril and Methodist in Skopje, Macedonia. She's been a member of the editorial boards of several prestigious academic journals, including the Journal for Balkan and Near Eastern Studies. She has also written numerous books, chapters, and articles that deal with the state building, particularly with regards to the Macedonian experience. Professor Vankovska, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good to be here. Good to see some people I haven't seen for quite some time. But honestly, talking about the state building in the Western Balkans raised me some strange emotions about if it's appropriate at all to speak about the spreading democracy and peace and Europeanization in this region while we are facing this catastrophic situation in Ukraine. Yes, the European Union has been a moral vertical for the people in this region for far too long. European Union is a holder of a Nobel Peace Prize, and we are still seeing European Union engage in Ukraine in a quite unexpected way. I would say more military, giving more military support than anything else. And honestly, seeing the procedure of giving the questionnaire to President Zelensky and returning back the answers raises probably a lot of memories with all of us who have spent so many years, efforts, months and years in order to get to that point. And now it seems that the war has an effect of catalyst of some processes, as Professor Chalic mentioned. Of course, I'm also not optimistic that it would finish in an expected way for the Ukrainian people. Also, I would agree with Florian's statement that the EU is not a single actor. But here I don't have in mind only the complexity of the European Union, its member states, supranational level, sub-state level, and all these institutions and the way they work together. But also there is a kind of confusion when we talk about the influence of European Union in this region, plus NATO, plus United States. So sometimes it is very difficult to differentiate who actually speaks what and demands what. Well, demands come from the West, of course, but it is sometimes difficult. For example, we had that situation in 2018 during the Prespa process when Chancellor Merkel visited Macedonia for the first time ever in so many years to come and to give the message that referendum should be successful, that the name should be changed and constitution and everything else. But nobody really knew if she was speaking as a leader of Germany, as a leader of European Union, or as a leader of a NATO member state, because at the end of the day, the Prespa agreement really achieved something, and that is the NATO membership for Macedonia. Nothing more in terms of the European the accession process. As you know, Macedonian case is very complex and it is in a stalemate right now, and it is very difficult for the people to understand. They sacrificed so much, they fulfilled so many demands, but at the end there is no result. So well, we are talking about all these reasons why the state building failed actually and is failing. And my guess is that it is going to be far worse in the future rather than better. We very rarely think of the iatrogenic effects of the Western medicines throughout the years. So there are counter effects from these medicines, because, you know, somebody mentioned before rule of law, or the European Union speaks something, one thing and then does another thing. We have experienced that for too many times. For example, turning your blind eye on a criminal way, the constitution is changed under bribery, extortion, and a lot of criminal things. And then to speak about rule of law on some technical issues and lawmaking and things like that. As said at the beginning, when we were arranging the schedule of the speakers, I wanted to be the last one because I'm the only one here, obviously, who not only comes from the region, but lives with the decisions of the European Union and all the other actors on the international arena. And still, what bothers me the most is the fact that even I, in my elaborations and in my writings, use more Western-splaining than Balkan-splaining or Yugosplaining, or, you know, more local approach and analysis of the things. It is always the external actors, including the academia, who decides what is successful and what is not. Are people to be happy with some deal or agreement or decision or not? If the people are not happy with that, they're not enough European. So we are always in a way to be, treated as unequal. Of course, this is unequal situation. This is asymmetric situation. And more than once on academic conferences, I've been told, you are ungrateful locals. Whenever one started to criticize things or to offer a different perspective, bottom-up perspective, there is immediately reaction. You're not grateful for what we are doing for you. We're investing money, we're investing expertise, we're investing our nerves and time to make you better, and you are not appreciating that enough. Why people are not appreciating, let's say, the interventions that come from above. I think Susan Woodward has a brilliant book about why interventions fail in the ideology of weak states, but also David Chandler with his Empire in Denial, when they deconstruct actually these power relations in which the state builders are not altruistic actors. They obviously work from the position of their national and collective interests, and not always in the interests of the people concerned. The people concerned are rarely consulted. Talking about democracy, which is a term used in the title of our event, obviously we can hardly talk about democracy. We are still on a level of democratization and these hybrid regimes, as we mentioned already. But that is not something typical for the Balkan region, but I would put it in a much wider global scheme. And there is a wonderful, brilliant book by my Greek colleague Vasilis Fouskas about the disintegration of Euro-Atlanticism and the rise of new authoritarianism, talking about this rising multipolar order. And unfortunately, the Balkan is somewhere where these big tectonic plates are clashing with each other. So it is a very, very difficult place to live, obviously not only now, but throughout the history. The position of the people, the position why they are skeptical and sometimes blame that they are not enough pro-European, or it is a measure of these public opinion polls in order to keep these expectations high, actually. It is because a simple reason: they feel alienated from their own elites. They do not trust the elites. And if we did change Gruevski with Zaev, we did not get any new quality, because it is all about the system, not about personalities. We are not we are attacking personalities instead of seeing the structural and systematic difficulties in the system. So we have countries where people are not allowed to bring or to amend their own constitution. It depends on foreign actors. They're not allowed to elect their own government because there are also some interferences. The same applies to many decisions that usually in democracies people do through their legitimate representatives or through referenda. As I said, democracy is dangerous, especially when there is xenocracy. I agree fully with the idea of stabilitocracy, of kleptocracy, and all these problems that we have with our elites, but we also have problem with the special representatives, embassies, envoys, and all these people that come to discipline the local actors whenever they misbehave. So there is some kind of control of the political process, And that's why I am probably biased here, saying that the blame for the failure of the state building is not to be found only with the locals who are incapable of doing things and progressing, but also on the way the external state builders approach the whole region, the experiences nobody mentions here. The necessity of reconciliation among the nation, among the states in the region, and normalization of their relations before they move to join European Union. I would stop here and would be happy to answer any questions in the later in the debate. Thank you. I hope I didn't talk too long.
Don't worry, Professor Biljana Vankovska. Right, so now we're gonna move on to a series of pre-submitted questions. So the first one we have is, do you think that Kosovo-Serbia dialogue is very crucial for both countries entering the European Union? Who wants to start first?
I'm
Okay.
I'm glad to answer, and then unfortunately I have to leave. As you know, can't stay any longer. But I would say, I mean, it's clear that neither. And again, I mean, I would say that a lot of the debates are based on the idea that the countries want to join the European Union, and again, this is not always automatically the case. In Serbia, the number of supporters for the European Union have declined substantially. Partly due to the government's deliberate attempts to undermine support. It's clear that you can't join the European Union without resolving the relations between Serbia and Kosovo. That's been made clear by the EU and its member states, especially countries like Germany, are not going to accept a Serbia which does not recognize Kosovo in some way or form. And of course, also Kosovo's status doesn't allow it to enter the European Union without a settlement which allows the 5 member states who haven't recognized Kosovo to recognize it. So in that sense, it requires a settlement. Unfortunately, there's no settlement in sight. I mean, I think quite clearly Serbia is not interested in a settlement under the current government. And as a result, the odds of actually resolving this dispute seem rather low at the moment, which means that basically neither Serbia nor Kosovo are going to join the European Union until this happens. And I think this is going to be quite a few years in the making until we could even think about getting to that. And with that, I'm afraid I have to excuse myself and say goodbye, and good to see many colleagues. Hope to see you again live soon.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Professor Bieber, for your contribution. I'll send you the recording afterwards. Okay, does anybody else want to answer this question?
I mean, just one comment on what Florian has said. I completely agree with him, but I think there's also, I completely agree with him. And I think the two, of course, reinforce themselves, right? The fact that the EU has failed to get the two countries to come to an agreement has also been very convenient for the elites in the two countries, right? And they haven't been the ones who have been pushing to say we need a solution on all of that, right? So there's also been this kind of, it has been this kind of very convenient situation for both sides, where it's an official EU policy to say we need a solution and we need to come together, but the EU is doing very little, the countries are doing very little, and everybody seems to be okay with this. That's the essence of stabilocracy.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Kill. Professor Judge, you wanted to say something?
I just would like to comment and to pick up the perspective that Biljana Vankovska has proposed. I don't think one should judge this process by saying the EU has failed to, normalize these relations, because it's not in the first place the task of the EU. Isn't it in the interest of the countries concerned to normalize relations with each other? Wouldn't it be, possible to set up a process without the EU? I'm a bit concerned that, this discussion, as many discussions, place a big responsibility on the side of the EU, as if the EU could create peace, democracy, reconciliation, and so on and so forth. And this is overstating, I think, both the role of the EU and also the essence of what is needed. Because if this doesn't come from the region in one way or the other, the EU could not and should not, impose anything, as we can see in Bosnia, where a peace has been imposed, which basically has frozen a conflict, and over now more than 25 years has led to a deterioration of the situation, just because actors in the region in Bosnia do not accept taking on responsibility and solving problems which are they responsible for. So the more I'm dealing with these problems, the more I'm actually hesitant to expect too much from external actors. And it would be rather good, I think, if the region or people in the region, I know there are many people in the region who would love to take things in their hands, but there is this problem of elites and so on and so forth. But it should be in the interest of Kosovo and of Serbia to settle this, and not in the EU's interest in the first place.
If I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The problem between Belgrade and Pristina, as I see it, has, of course, many dimensions, but I would select just two. First of all, European Union failed to make a common position regarding recognition of Kosovo. So there are member states that don't recognize Kosovo. So what is the incentive of Serbia to go further in the process of negotiation when they know that Kosovo has been already blocked by some member states of European Union? The second thing is the power of example. The Macedonian example is catastrophic, sends catastrophic message to the region, because the Serbian political elite says, see what the Macedonian government did. They gave up their name, the constitution, the identity. They are now negotiating for their language, for their history, for anything that has nothing to do with European Union, that has nothing to do with Copenhagen criteria. So why should we accept separation of part of our territory? It is the Serbian position, of course, when in return we are not going to get anything. So there is this status quo, and I think that for a long time it will be a frozen conflict, the same one as the one in Macedonia that many disregard. They just overlook the fact that the Ohrid Framework Agreement did not resolve the basic essential conflict in the Macedonian society. The disintegration process is ongoing, but the problem with the international state building is that somebody else decides if people should be happy or if their story is success story. And I'm fed up with listening that Macedonia is success story from the time of Oasis of Peace. Then we were a success story in 2001. Then we were a success story in 2004, then in 2018, success story by success story and no progress at all. So yes, I agree with Marie-Janine that it is a matter of the people concerned to do things, to take their destiny in their hands and to do things for themselves, for their own benefit, not for some future European Union membership. I'm afraid that even if it comes to some future situation when miraculously we are going to join the Union, it would not be the same union we dreamed of for years, because as we change, the European Union changes, and the global environment is getting worse and worse. And now we are talking about possibility of global conflict, not about European Union as I don't know, the paradise on earth or something that would provide well-being automatically by joining the union. We are not even learning from the examples of Greece, of Bulgaria, of Romania, of people that have a huge number of population that lives on the brink of poverty. The debtocracy is some of these terms that we did not mention. We are all so much indebted that we are not economically viable as states, and we are dreaming about joining European Union in order to feed us, to keep us warm, to keep us safe, and so on. Too many expectations have been raised throughout the years because, as I said, European Union turned into a fairy tale, into I don't know, something imaginary, and it is the role of the political elites, the media, and unfortunately the foreign actors that come here and say, give up your name and everything will be fine. Tomorrow you will wake up as Europeans and live rich lives. So there are a lot of lies in politics, as Professor Mearsheimer would say.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lankuska. We actually have two more pre-submitted questions regarding Serbia, surprise, surprise. So one is, what do you think of Serbia still being the only country in Europe staying neutral with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Do you think this is not a good example of a country to be followed? And what is your opinion about Serbia still not apologizing for past crimes and genocide in Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo? Who wants to go first? Yes, Vienna.
As for apologies in the process of reconciliation, it is just a symbolic gesture. And we saw a few such events, not of the type of Willy Brandt and everything, the whole process that started in Germany that we usually take as an excellent example. So it is not about apology, it is about dealing with the past, dealing with one's own dark parts of the history. And it is again up to the people to do so, but it is probably very, very difficult under all these hardships that societies deal with to come even with this very painful one. As for the neutrality, honestly, I would be much happier if my country was neutral at this point than to be a NATO member state, because in addition to all our poverty and weak economic status, and we are hardly dealing with ordinary life, we have to provide for military aid, probably troops if necessary, and we are still buying American weapon systems that are too costly for a poor Macedonia. Macedonia went into this process of Europeanization, joining the West in order to become less poor. Unfortunately, we are getting more and more poor. So I would personally like to see more peace initiatives, diplomatic initiatives, negotiations around Ukraine than taking sides, because taking sides and eye for eye, as Gandhi said, and the whole world would go blind.
Okay, Dr. Key, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to completely disagree with Biljana. I think people who want to stay neutral in the case of aggression and breaches of international law are fundamentally on the wrong side of history. And especially small countries like in the Balkans have a inherent interest in principles of international law being upheld, right? The US don't care, China don't care, India probably doesn't care, certainly Russia doesn't care, because these countries can live according to the rule of the strongest will survive, right? Smaller countries have an interest in rules. have an interest in regulations, rules, laws that you stick to. And one of those fundamental principles of international law is that you not use aggression against the country, right? And Russia's aggression is something that is a fundamental change to the world order that we have seen after 1945. Right, and it is not the same as the intervention in Kosovo, and it is not the same as the Iraq War, and we can discuss that at another event why this is. So in that regard, I think countries cannot and should not be neutral, and particularly countries in the Western Balkans that have all gone through conflict, right, that have experienced the destruction, the refugees, and the death that war brings. Cannot sit on the fence and say, oh, we remain neutral. And for Serbia, I believe that its neutrality will have long-lasting problematic consequences, right? I mean, Serbia is basically moving itself out, not just of its European perspective, but it's moving itself out of a more or less civilized world. When you look at the UN resolutions against Russia's aggression, you're looking at 140, 150 countries, right? Condemning the aggression, right? And Serbia is not openly one of them. And that's a key problem, right? And it is a worrying bit is that for the EU, it shows how influential Russia is in the region. But I think the other worrying bit is that a country like Serbia not speaking out openly against such fundamental breaches will in the long term also weaken its own argument towards holding on to Kosovo, right?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kiel. And now we have Professor Chalic who wants to give a take.
Because Serbia has joined the UN resolution against, concerning the war. It is not that Serbia supports openly the Russian aggression. Russia maintains not even that it is neutral, but that it has good foreign policy relations with 4 actors. One is EU, then there's US, there's Russia, and there's China. So it appears as if it continues the Yugoslav, non-aligned way, which is of course not really the same thing because we live in very different times. One also has to consider that Serbia is 90% dependent on Russian energy. So for the countries, it's not that simple to say today we, interrupt all relations with Russia and then we pay the price. As we can see, it might be very high. So 90% energy dependency. And Serbia has a large pro-Russian sentiment among the population. There are many people who believe that, or they feel close to Russia for certain reasons, be it history or culture or so, and Russian propaganda is very strong. This is also true in Serbia, so that many people are probably, believing in what Russian propaganda is telling. Yet I feel one should be a bit, I'm a bit hesitant to condemn countries or people from the region if they say, like Biljana did, maybe I would not like to take sides in the position that we are. And I feel it might not be the right way to force small countries or smaller, weaker countries to pursue certain policies. If even bigger ones are inconsistent, like my own country, we still buy all the gas and stuff from Russia and so on. And how can we, force smaller countries in much weaker economic position to take the full risk? So in that, I'm maybe a bit more in between the two speakers.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Chalic. And now we're going to move on to another question. Is the European Union an imperialist formation? Who wants to start?
Let me start and provoke debate. In my view, it is a soft imperialism, and it is a neo-colonialism. The way it deals and projects the soft power, especially, you know, the Balkans is a specific region where the cultures, the civilizations mix and cross. There is a process of this, as I think I mentioned, the mission civilatrice, that we should become Europeans and divorce from our Balkan identity as something primitive, bad, and not good enough, and so on. So, I would, of course, disagree with Soren's position here vis-a-vis Ukraine, and I would just stress again, I would expect a Nobel Peace Prize winner to be leading the process of stopping the violence, the ceasefire. I'm not saying that being neutral means not caring about the developments or being passive. On the contrary, not pumping in more weapons, not Mr. Borrell saying in Kiev, you are going to win a military victory over nuclear Russia. That is irresponsible statement. Adding more fuel on this flame is something that shows that actually, I'm not sure if European Union is European Union anymore, the one that we imagine and know, or it has turned into some symbiosis with NATO now, and United States is the ultimate benefactor of this situation. European Union is losing during this war. Of course, the Ukrainians are the victims, and it is unbearable horror taking place there. But in long run, European Union is going to really lose many of these attributes that we hope that it still cares about, these European values, peacefulness, and peace by peaceful means, not by military means. And the situation in Germany is, for me personally, very, very strange, to put it mildly, because I would never expect Germany to switch around so quickly. The same applies to Sweden and Finland now wanting to join NATO. Instead of giving good example of neutrality for Ukraine in order to find some kind of compromise solution, these two neutral countries are joining NATO, and so which means that Ukraine has no reason to even think of neutrality, but to go until it is possible. So that promises not really positive perspectives for the whole world. That is my position. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to go next?
And I'm happy. Two things. The first thing on Ukraine, it's not like the Europeans are not trying to do any diplomacy. I mean, Scholz and Macron are regularly still phoning Putin, right? They are putting pressure diplomatically on the Russians. There are lines of communication. There have been visits to Kiev. There's been European support to find a forum to reach a ceasefire. The EU has openly supported the UN getting involved in the conflict. And it's not like, it's like everybody is saying, you know, we got to arm Ukraine and we're not going to do anything diplomatic to solve the issue. That's just not what's happening. But we shouldn't forget that President Zelensky, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, openly offered to Russians to talk about Ukrainian neutrality, right? He offered that, to say we are willing to discuss that if Russia ends the aggression. Did Russia pick it up? Did they end the war? They did not, right? So it's not like, you know, there's no diplomacy coming from either side and that all the EU and the European countries are doing are arming Ukraine. But those that want to be neutral in the face of such evil aggression, ultimately support the aggressor. That's as simple as this. It's been like that in history, and it seems to me that is the obvious thing, and to support Ukrainians in defending their country strikes me as not being fundamentally wrong. Of course, we all also agree that a diplomatic solution needs to be found, and ultimately that will be the answer to the conflict. It's very obvious the conflict won't be decided on the battleground, on the battlefield. In terms of the EU and the question on neo-imperialism, there's the short and the long answer. The short answer is it depends on how we define imperialism, right? If we look at imperialism as it's historically understood in the context of the 18th and 19th century, the direct intervention in countries, the resource exploitation, right? The also violent oppression of local populations, particularly, but not exclusively in Africa, then of course that's not what the EU is doing, right? I'm kind of not seeing the German-French tanks on the streets of Sarajevo or Skopje forcing Macedonian or Bosnian people to work for Germany or France, right? So that's not what's happening. If you define imperialism or modern imperialism as a way of, expanding your values, your economic system, your principles and beliefs, then even that is very hard to see this is done through forceful way. I mean, EU enlargement remains a fundamentally voluntary process. You can choose not to join. Nobody's forcing you. The Europeans aren't standing there and saying you have to become a member, right? No the European Union has never said that. The European Union didn't send tanks to Iceland when they decided to stop the enlargement process. They didn't even send tanks to the UK when the British decided to leave, right? I mean, it's hard to talk about imperialism, and we shouldn't forget that several governments and several elites in the countries and the regions have committed to EU integration. By the way, even the most authoritarian ones have at least rhetorically kept up the idea of pro-European integration. That's a key difference of the current authoritarianism to the 1990s Milosevic and Tudjman era, right? So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dr. Kiel. Professor Čalić, do you want to say something with regards to this question, or in that case, we'll move on. Okay, the last pre-submitted question was, what are, in your views, the future prospects of EU state building in the Western Balkans? Anybody want to go first?
I think we responded to that through our discussions already. We gave some ideas, so
okay.
I don't know what would we add more.
If anybody wants to add more, otherwise I'm going to ask the other members of the audience to either raise your hand if you want to ask a question or write it in the chat. Okay, George Schaff, go ahead.
Hello. Good talk, very, very interesting. But while listening to that, I noticed quite a glaring sort of omission between all of the talks. And that was Montenegro, a West Balkans country that seems notable in that it seems of the non-EU West Balkans countries, the furthest along in the EU state building. It's closed several chapters. Support for EU membership has consistently been very high for the past 10 years. It joined NATO not too long ago. So I'm wondering what's everyone's sort of thoughts towards, how does Montenegro basically fit into this overall picture? Because it seems so far that the speakers are presenting this idea of, the EU fails. It's always, failing in making sure that Bosnia and Serbia, follow rational politics. Yet there's Montenegro, which seems to be well along the path to doing so.
Okay, anybody want to give their take on Montenegro.
I'm happy to say one or two words about Montenegro is a fascinating case because when the first articles and academic publications were written on stableocracy, Montenegro was your key case study. No, you had the DPS, you had Đukanović in power for a very long time, right? Always reinventing himself, first a friend of Milosevic, then an opponent of Milosevic, first a supporter of the union with Serbia, then a strong supporter of Montenegrin independence, right? So, then eventually elections happened and the DPS for the first time lost its majority, right? Change can come through electoral politics, which is always good news in the region, right? Because sometimes people did question that. You know, in that regard, thumbs up to Slovenia for doing that as well. And since then, we have seen that changing a government is much easier than changing fundamentally politics, right? Because Montenegro has become harder to govern because of the different coalition partners that, you know, was basically a coalition of convenience, all the DPS opponents, some of which were very liberal, pro-European forces, some of which were very pro-Russian parties. And it was easier for them to defeat the DPS and to come up with a common governance agenda and find agreement. And that's kind of part of where Montenegro has been stuck in this kind of problematic situation between the different governing party, and of course also with a lot of blockage from the president, from Đukanović, to kind of limit government policy wherever he can, and him trying now to completely undermine the government, bringing it to a fall and hoping the DPS would make a return. The problem, in one sentence to explain why Montenegro is such a difficult country, it's because I think Montenegro was kind of the front runner in EU integration for a certain time. And that was until it came to the critical chapters. If you look at the chapters that are closed for Montenegro, I think it's kind of the chapter on energy and the chapter on sports, I think. And education, I think, is the other one that's closed, right? These are not fundamentally problematic chapters. Fundamentally problematic chapters are the one on the rule of law, right? They are the one on functioning institutions. These are the ones where really, you know, authoritarian tendencies are being attacked. And the moment these were being negotiated and opened and discussed with Montenegrin officials, Montenegro's progress and status as a front runner very much came under threat, right? And that's why we can see no chapters have been closed since I think 2018 now. So there's been very, very limited progress in Montenegro from an early promising start. And that has to do with the shifting government, but it also has to do with the fact that when you are an authoritarian regime, there are some concessions you can make, but when it goes to the core of what's your power balance, you stop kind of properly engaging. And that's exactly what we saw in the case of the DPS.
Thank you, Dr. Kiel. Now, is there anybody else who wants to talk about Montenegro? Otherwise, we're going to move on to another question from the audience. Okay, I'm going to move on to a couple of questions from an audience member. The UN Security Council Resolution 1233 provided for a Serbian military contingent in Kosovo. Why has that never materialized? So that's the first question. And the second question is it legal for the European Union to be mute on its member state Bulgaria's official stance that the Macedonian language does not exist? Who wants to start? Yes, Professor Vankoska.
Obviously, there is a typo. It's 1244, if I'm not wrong. it was long ago, and everybody actually forgot the UN Security Resolution, and many other UN positions have been forgotten on the way. But there is realpolitik. So that is the only simple answer to this complex question. But I'm afraid that the boomerang effect of the Kosovo precedent is something that we see nowadays, how that case is used or misused by Russia. And also the theories of preemptive strikes. So everything that we get wrong in terms of international law application then hits us back in a very harsh way. As for Macedonia and this dispute with Bulgaria, actually Bulgaria has dispute, we don't know with what, but I understand the question of Alexander Shulevsky, because, believing so much in European values, in this normative idea of Europe, Macedonia has been left aside as someone, if you want to join, then you will have to give up everything that your neighbors ask. And we, especially the intellectuals, and I remember maybe 20 years ago, I wrote an open letter to my foreign colleagues, asking them, where is your support, your moral support, your academic support? At least make a petition or something and raise your voice to say that this is really something that it is hard to understand. We believe that one ordeal with Greece is the most horrible thing, and now we see this even worse one, of course. All these problems have their deep roots, but at least European, if not European officials, then European scholars, intellectuals, journalists, I don't know, associations, think tanks, they could have raised the voice and say enough is enough, because Macedonia is really paying price that no country on earth would ever pay. And then it is very painful to hear nobody ask you to join EU. You can say no, it is not possible, because 30 years you live with the dream that foreign actors make it look real, and they say, yes, we welcome you. I was just reading some archives this morning, and I found the statements of Romano Prodi in 2004 when he delivered the questionnaire to Macedonia in Skopje. And he said, you are very welcome. You just need to resolve this little problem, and then we open the gates for you. So it is long, so many generations grew up with these problems. I'm old, but these young fellows who were born in 1991 are now mature people, and they know nothing else but the story of EU as heaven on earth. So, and then there are on the background, twisting arms and making pressures and even blackmails, not maybe by Brussels, by European Union, but by Washington. You are not allowed to do it your way because you have to get into NATO. And that is what happened 4 years ago, unfortunately, for nothing. And we are going to stay in front of the gates of the European Union, of the paradise, I don't know for how long, as well as Montenegro with their internal problems. But of course, the Macedonians are particularly sensitive, and especially hearing that northern adding to our name. So yes, I just wanted to say something about the title of the event, mentioning the Western Balkans. That is also a result of power politics, because some powerful centers, create regions, recreate them. There is a dynamic geometry and geography of the region. Who is in, who is out, and who is deserving, who is not deserving. There is no Western Balkans. We all know that there is a convention in the Brussels to call this region with this name that has no geographic or political or historical background. The same applies for North Macedonians. There are no North Macedonians, and it is very difficult for us to accept all these identity changes, because the state building now turns into nation building, into national engineering of a small state of 2 million people, which is shameful for those who make the pressures, not for the victims, of course. So sorry for being emotional on this issue.
Anybody else want to sort of give their responses to these two questions? Nobody? Okay. There's another question, and this is, I think, refers particularly to Professor Čalić. How does Croatia's membership of the EU impact the Western Balkan integration with the EU? On the surface, Croatia's economic growth was about double the regional average last year, but this is probably not the full story. Has it been a push or pull factor for other nations in the region?
I think the Croatian accession had great impact on the region because it gave the good example that, or it's the first country out of the group of the Western Balkans, which was able to join the European Union. And I think that Croatia has demonstrated that great progress could be made, because Croatia was a country in a war. And it had really to make big reforms, and this worked as an incentive in the region. And if what I witnessed was kind of enthusiasm in the region, in the neighboring countries, that like one of our group has actually made this achievement. This is one. Secondly, Croatia has benefited from EU integration. GDP per capita in Croatia is considerably higher than GDP in the rest of the region. There are divergences too, but the economic impact is visible in many fields in terms of investment and so on and so forth. Also the negative, like migration, many brain drain, many skilled workers, medical doctors and so on, leaving Croatia, searching job opportunities in the EU. This is also negative, if you wish so, impact. And thirdly, Croatia has promoted the cause of the Western Balkans during its presidency. Or was it last year? No, 2 years ago. It has promoted many of these regional initiatives by the Regional Cooperation Council. So in that, I am not quite sure if I understand this with the pull and the push, but it is, I guess, a pull, you know, because it gives the good example.
Thank you, for Professor Čalić. I think we have got another question, and unless Professor Vankuska and Dr. Kiel want to give their own answers to the question.
The only thing I would add, I agree that Croatia's membership has been a very important example, although of course time plays a role. No, the fact that it's been such a long time since Croatia joined has also kind of, you know, all these hopes that were created kind of have gone down. And the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, of course, Croatia joining has also shifted dynamics of Croatia's engagement with the region. On the one side, on a positive note, that Croatia is one of the champions of further enlargement and further integration of the region, right? And of all countries, generally, Croatia is very supportive, and as such, in a very enlargement skeptical EU, Croatia is in a minority with other countries, but it is generally, independent of who's in power, very positive towards enlargement, of course, for its own interest. But on a negative side, Croatia has, of course, used its own position to also push for its own interests in the region. It has done that in terms of specific conditionality towards Serbia, where it has threatened further progress based on bilateral issues. It is doing that on a daily basis by directly interfering and intervening in the internal politics of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's in fact a more or less direct participant in the Bosnian discussions on a new electoral law, right? And if Croatia stands in these negotiations and says, if you don't fulfill, the demands of the Bosnian Croatian Democratic Union, we will veto not only any further progress of Bosnia, but potentially even any funding release or any further support, that becomes highly, highly problematic. I mean, the Croatian government is playing a very problematic role in the constitutional politics of Bosnia. And I think this is also something we need to recognize.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kill. Now, there's another question in the chat, and this is directed specifically at Professor Čalić and Dr. Kale. How do you assess the EU's political responsibility for the failing state-building process as part of the EU's foreign policy? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I go first, but I will be very brief because it's a very large question and a critical question, because the EU was so ambitious after the 1990s with having the new political order and promoting reconstruction and reconciliation and regional cooperation and EU integration. And of course, state building is part of this. I believe it was never realistic to believe for any actor, be it the EU or the US or any other actor, to be able, by creating this kind of foreign missions and large political processes, to do state building. We have seen this in Afghanistan. I think if the EU was realistic or open, one should say the process failed, at least as regards Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a failure, but at this stage, still people try to defend the cause and say, okay, there's a bit of a crisis, but this will go away, and so on and so forth. I don't believe that. I think this is really a wrong approach and will lead nowhere. So in that, I'm not sure if I correctly responded to this question. Responsibility for the state building as part of EU's foreign policy. Yes, there is responsibility for that. Being unrealistic, raising hopes, expectations, building, the whole accession policy is built on the assumption that the EU will be able to resolve this failing state problems, which is evidently not. But this is, a far-reaching statement, and I should be probably more cautious and give to Dr. Kyle.
Yeah, it is. I completely agree. It is a very big question. I think what Biljana said earlier, I would completely. You see, Biljana, we do agree on many things, but what Biljana said earlier on Macedonia, on the situation in North Macedonia, I think there the EU is directly responsible for deepening political cleavages and tensions, and also completely failing its promises. Because North Macedonia did everything it was asked for. It came to an agreement with Greece. There was a peaceful transition of powers, what many people didn't predict would happen, right? There were new concessions made even towards Bulgaria when North Macedonia was asked, right? And the EU in return did nothing, absolutely nothing, right? And that, I mean, people in Bosnia and in Kosovo and in Serbia see that. They're not blind to that. They see that. And they see, well, Macedonia is doing all of these things and is making some very painful reforms. I mean, a compromise on a country's name. We shouldn't underestimate what that means for sovereignty and for self-identification and what commitment the North Macedonian government did by agreeing to change the name, right? And what did the EU offer in return? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing, because it's still being held responsible by some of it's being held hostage by some of its member states for their own bilateral interests. And in terms of Macedonia, I think we can really talk about a failure. I would really talk about a failure when we look at EU-North Macedonia relations. In the other cases, I would agree completely what both Biana and Professor Karlik have said. It also needs to be a give and take, right? The countries need to make the effort. Ultimately, it's a voluntary process. You want to join, the criteria are clear. They're in the Copenhagen criteria. They're in the acquis that tells you what you have to do. So you need to make the effort. The EU can't make the efforts for you, right? If you prove that, if you can show that, then the EU can engage and deal with that. Has the EU been as involved and as positive and as directly engaged and supportive as it could have been? I mean, I think the tenor of all speakers here was no, it has not, for a variety of reasons. That alone does not explain the situation in the region. That's a much more complicated set of development in the region. Has the EU completely failed the region? I also don't believe that. As Professor Karlik has said, the EU is still the most important trade partner. You know, I mean, at the time when, you know, Russia sent in a couple of masks in the COVID crisis to Serbia, China sent in 2, I think initially they sent like 2 breather heart lung machines. The EU gave 250 million euros, right, to help Serbia cope with the COVID pandemic. I mean, the difference is the Serbian government didn't publicly state that, right? They said, oh, look how great China is, look how great Russia is, how they are supporting us, right? I mean, it's not that the EU is not doing anything. The EU is doing something. Should the EU do more to uphold its promises? I mean, we shouldn't forget that enlargement also is a promise and a commitment of the EU. Absolutely, I think we are all in agreement on this as well, right? So.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kuhl. I think we have time for one last question, which is here in the chat. Bosnia-Herzegovina is famously split between Bosnia itself and the Republic of Srpska. I understand that it often paralyzes the nation as a whole. Could you explain in more depth the impact of these divisions? And was this dynamic changed significantly by Srpska's threat last year to become independent in 2022? Just so you know, like, if anybody wants to respond, okay, respond. Otherwise, we'll.
I can do that very briefly, because my take on this is that the Dayton Accord did end the war, but it did not solve the conflicts which caused the war over the identity, the internal setup, borders, constitution, right of the people. All these questions are somehow still in the air, and even the elites are mainly the same as those who started the war. So it makes it very, the hope at the time was that over time, rebuilding the country and starting all these processes, including EU accession and so on, these older conflicts would at least be alleviated and then maybe go away, and there some new identity could grow. And this turned out not to be the case. On the contrary, the splits have become deeper, and political divisions too, them totally different aims and interests of the 3 nations which are constituent people.
Professor Chalic, you accidentally muted yourself.
The Serbian Republic has fought a war to become an independent or autonomous or independent entity. They did not lose the war. So there were no losers, no winners in this war over Bosnia, which makes them believe that they have the right to continue on their way. So and we have seen in the last many years, step-by-step worsening of the situation, with Republika Srpska withdrawing from common projects, and last year even from the institutions, and they annulled a number of laws and so on. They claim they want to have their army and so on and so forth. Though they basically do not accept the Dayton Accord anymore, and the dynamic, there has a continuity of this. This is not, a new phenomenon, but we have seen this over many years, which is new in last year, that it was now like stated so in such a blunt way, and that it has led to a total paralysis of the institutions. And what is also new is that the international environment is now such that these things can happen, and there is no punishment whatsoever from any side, not even from the EU, because as has been said, the EU is split, and Hungary and Croatia would object any sanctioning of the Bosnian Serbs. And this brings us actually back to the question of this whole debate about the role of the EU and unanimity.
Okay, does anybody else want to respond to this question?
There's so much to say about Bosnia. Can't answer that very briefly. I agree with most of what Professor Karlik has said. I think Dayton is a good peace agreement. We shouldn't forget that there hasn't been a single person that has been killed in Bosnia as a result of ethnic tension since 1995. Right, and that's a huge success. And I do a lot of work nowadays in Syria and in Myanmar. And when you look at Bosnia from the perspective of those two countries, then Dayton, of course, is an absolute success story, because it brought peace. And what's more important than people, than stopping people dying? But of course, we all agree that in terms of providing a framework for democratization and providing a guide that could help the country to integrate into the European Union, Dayton is simply not a good framework. It's a good framework to end a war. It's not a good framework for peace. And the big mistake at Dayton was that the Dayton Agreement, which was probably the only agreement that could have been reached in 1995, but that agreement was not time limited with the sunset clause, to say within a time you need to have a better, more Bosnian-owned constitutional assembly. There are many examples of that, South Africa, for example, where those things were used, and that kind of legacy hunts Bosnia until today. It has a framework, constitutional framework that ended a war, not a constitutional framework to govern peace.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kill. Professor Lankaska, do you want to say something to this regard, or? I think her screen is frozen.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Mm. I tried to get in touch with her, but it says that her screen is she's not in a meeting apparently. So, well, she's back. Professor Vanko.
I had a problem with the internet for a moment, so here I am. Yes, is there any question or?
No, just asked if you wanted to give your answer to this last question about Bosnia. Otherwise,
it's too long story, too complex, and I fully agree with Marie-Janine said at the beginning that the seed of the problem is in the Dayton Agreement. As much as it sees the violent conflict, it never really laid the ground for a workable state. So nothing is new. Unfortunately, 25 and more years after the Dayton Agreement, we are still in this stalemate, and it's very painful even to see that the UN Security Council is gathering again to discuss possible war in Bosnia. And when I hear things like that, I immediately get in touch with my friends and colleagues in Bosnia and ask them, is it true? Is it really possible to see a war again? And they're confused. They say people don't even think of a new wave of violence and to only think these political war games, symbolic games with Republika Srpska, Dodik, and everyone else. And Croatia is also involved into this mess about the Croats and their position. It very much, it reminds us who still remember how the war started in former Yugoslavia, all these gatherings in Sarajevo, in Zetra Hall, where people were singing for peace and hoping for peace. And we all know how that ended. I only hope that this is a false flag now and probably some kind of disturbance due to these global shifts and dramatic events elsewhere. So things are immediately reflected on Bosnia. But Bosnia indeed have a problem with this. Its state functioning very much alike to Macedonia. We need another debate to compare the Ohrid Framework Agreement with the Dayton Agreement. The situation in Bosnia a little bit more complex because of the three entities, ethnic entities, and their complex relations. In Macedonia, there are two, but it is not working and not in a democratic way. It is a politics of blackmail, mutual, unprincipled bargaining, international community involvement. It is the only way that the state can move on. So all this talk about European integration really is not with much ground, I'm afraid, until we resolve these basic issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Vankovska. Now, well, I think we might as well end it here. I would like to thank the panelists once again for accepting my invitation and for contributing to the discussion. I hope you all enjoyed this event, and I look forward to interacting with you again soon. I will make sure to send you all a recording of this event afterwards.
Thank you. All the best.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.